All right, this lecture is on the laws of war. Now, aside from questions about when it's justified to go to war, there are important questions to be asked about what sorts of acts may be perpetrated in war, and what, if anything, limits armies in their treatments of enemy soldiers, enemy civilians, guerrillas, and terrorists. Now, by limit here, I don't mean just how self-interest might limit them or how enemy actions might limit them, but what limits the permissible treatment of enemy soldiers, civilians, guerrillas, and terrorists. So I'm asking a normative question here. This sort of inquiry is sometimes referred to by its Latin name, Jusinbello, or the law or laws of war. At first glance, the idea of the morality of war is odd. The outbreak of warfare suggests that something wrong has already happened. Phrases like the best kind of war or the ideal war are uttered with the understanding that if all were really as it should be, there would be no warfare at all. The laws of war are created not to guide us to ever greater heights of human civilization or happiness, but to mitigate unfortunate but foreseeable circumstances in which human beings tend to find themselves. The fact that the laws of war are meant to deal with non-ideal scenarios, just like theories of punishment, does not make them any less important to think about. Right? We don't have to think about punishment until an infraction or transgression has occurred, and we don't have to think about the laws of war until warfare breaks out. Well, ideally, we would think about it before warfare breaks out, but the situation to apply these things doesn't arise until warfare breaks out. So let's talk about some approaches to just war. In his article in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Seth Lazar divides theories of just war into 4 categories. There are traditionalists, revisionists, pacifists, and realists. And so we'll see what each of these views has to say about the law of war. Now, realists, as we've seen, are those who deny flatly that justice applies to warfare. Now, they don't have to deny that some approaches to warfare might be more desirable on moral grounds. They don't have to say it wouldn't be better, right, if soldiers did one thing or another, or that they don't deny that soldiers are permitted to be charitable. But what they do deny is that any atrocity whatsoever committed during a time of recognized interstate conflict against soldiers or civilians can be called unjust. In warfare, the only appropriate standard is winning or achieving one's strategic objectives. That's the standard by which armies are judged, and all means, on the realist view, are permitted in order to achieve one's strategic objectives. Morality, or shall we say justice, has nothing to do with it. Now, categorically opposed to realists, you have pacifists. Pacifists come in many different varieties, like realists, but all share the view that all warfare, aggressive, preventive, or defensive, is wrong, right? Not just wrong on its face, like a non-ideal situation, but any organized warfare is going to be wrong. Pacifists don't have to accept that as an individual you can defend yourself from attacks. They don't have to deny the right to self-defense for individuals. Some actually do that as well, but many do not. What they do have to defend is the idea that organized state-sponsored violence, including organized state-sponsored defense against aggression, is always wrong. For example, that no freedom or self-governance is worth the sacrifice of thousands and thousands of soldiers, because that's what warfare entails. Even when you're defending yourself is often massive loss of life, and that is what pacifists object to. Now, in between those two extremes, you have those who think that, at least some of the time, for some purposes, governments may organize citizens into a fighting force, and they may do so if they observe certain limits. Now, traditionalists defend the view that those purposes and limits are mostly those that have been articulated by common agreement among states. These rules are justified by reference to foundations in human rights, including the right to political independence, the right to resist aggression. I suspect you could throw reciprocity in there, right? So I will grant you this favor, so you should grant me this other favor. On the other hand, what these foundations also do is resist the scope of permissible wartime behavior. So what it does is that it restrains the combatants. They could do some pretty awful things, but justice in war requires them not to. Now, Walzer is a traditionalist. He seeks to explain and justify most state agreements about the conduct of war. And he only challenges these agreements moderately in specific instances, right? He makes fairly minor criticisms of how these laws have been formulated and articulated, but broadly he agrees that they should be there, and that in their current form there's good reasons for them being there. Traditionalism tends to recognize the special nature of states in warfare, and divide the world rather starkly into soldiers on the one hand and civilians on the others. By contrast, that gray area of non-state combatants, terrorists, guerrilla fighters, revolutionaries, even political operatives that incite violence, these folks receive fairly little protection or consideration in traditionalist accounts of just war. So traditionalists emphasize generally three things. Walzer's pretty clear about this. Discrimination, which means that combatants must target other combatants only. It's a way of restricting warfare primarily to the people who are engaged in fighting, and we have to be able to identify those people, so they have to usually be wearing uniforms of some sort. Proportionality, that's to say that foreseen but unintended harms must be proportionate to the military advantages achieved. So it's going to be the case that unfortunately discrimination fails sometimes. When discrimination fails, that is to say civilians and combatants are in the same area and it's not possible to discriminate between them, or not easy to discriminate between them, it has to be the case that on balance use of force is justified by the advantages that are to be gained. And finally, necessity, right? This is the idea that in order to achieve an objective, you should use the least harmful means, right? It's possible to achieve an objective in a wide variety of ways, but the right way to achieve the objective is to use the least harmful means. Now, traditionalists deal with the non-ideal nature of warfare by trying to quarantine it and its effects into a special arena where the laws of war will then apply. Walzer says, for instance, that naval warfare or warfare in the desert is a purest form of war because there are no civilians around typically, right? It's just the combatants, and there's little risk that the activities of the combatants are going to spill over and harm bystanders. In that sense, carving out this arena of war is very much like making war into a game, where in the context of the game, moves are permitted that otherwise would not be permitted. So for example, I like to use the example of hockey or baseball, where it's customary and permitted for players to brawl, and although they might face punishment from the league, they don't face any legal consequences for brawling in the game. Now, if you and your friends get together and brawl with some other folks outside a club or a bar or something, it's likely that you will be arrested and face legal consequences. But hockey players and baseball players within the context of that game can do things that you and I can't. And so the idea is that the purpose of the game and the rules, the special rules that are afforded these people, are justified by the overall purpose of the activity. In games, the rules are justified by the fun or entertainment of the game, and in warfare, they're justified often by the overall goal of settling some dispute that otherwise would continue to fester on. Now, revisionists also believe that warfare can be justified, but they dispute the state-centered approach of the traditionalists. Now, in particular, the traditional approach is usually understood as being too insensitive to the power and class differentials between combatants. Right? The traditionalist approach is generally associated with equal treatment of each side. Right? So the idea is that soldiers on each side, regardless of the justice or injustice of their cause, are treated equally, in the sense, not in the sense that it's equally okay to kill your own soldiers and other soldiers, but in the sense that we're not going to judge their actions by the presumptive justice or injustice of the cause of war. For revisionists, this is hard to swallow. In particular because these sorts of rules make it very hard for non-states or organizations that aspire to become states to fight in a morally legitimate way and pursue their aims. And yet it is argued by these revisionists many causes are just and are worth engaging in by those who can only engage in them in ways that traditionalists would find to be unjust. So, for example, terrorism or guerrilla activity or other kinds of resistance, violent resistance, maybe political assassinations, all of those things tend to be either outside the scope of just war theory or very much frowned upon by just war theory as being unjust, as violating the laws of war. Revisionists would usually tend to be more sympathetic to the claims made by those who fight asymmetric wars. On the revisionist views, we shouldn't really give states the status that we give them. Many existing states are pretty illegitimate and unjust. They perpetrate injustices on their citizens or keep them in a state of servitude. And as a result, it's almost always going to be the case that people who resist the state are going to be at a power disadvantage in terms of weapons and resources and money. And so they're going to have to fight differently if they want to win. As a result of the justice of their cause, revisionists will say, well, they should be allowed to fight differently than armies. So revisionists reject the notion advanced by traditionalists the parties to war ought to be understood as moral equals, and the cause should matter a little bit with respect to the means you're allowed to use. If your cause is more just, you should be allowed to do more things in pursuit of it. You should be allowed, and if your cause is not just, arguably you shouldn't be allowed to defend yourself at all on this view, right? If you're a criminal, and revisionists often see states as being criminals, if you're a criminal, you're not allowed to defend yourself from arrest, right? It's wrong for you to defend yourself. On the other hand, if you're being wrongfully arrested, perhaps in some circumstances you're allowed to at least run away, if not resist arrest. And so, as a result, the ethics are asymmetric depending on whether you are or are not a criminal. That's how we look at ordinary justice, and revisionists say, well, we shouldn't give states the consideration that traditionalists give them. So working for a state does not excuse you from your ordinary moral duties. And arguably you should refuse to work for the state if you are going to be asked to do things that oppress people or violate their rights on a systematic sort of basis. Now, what is to be gained by all these debates? Right? A lot of people ask, okay, let's say that we come up with a good theory of just war, whatever it is, revisionist, realist, pacifist, or traditionalist. What's the payoff? You know, applying moral standards typically requires level-headed moral judgment and concern for the dignity of all parties. It kind of requires to take a step back from the world and evaluate things a little more objectively. But participants in warfare are quintessentially in the position of not being able to do that, right? They're not in a good position to step back and consider the options and the alternatives. They're often in the heat of battle. So what difference will these standards make except to confuse people who are just trying to fight to survive? That's often a criticism of this sort of enterprise. I'm going to try to attempt to answer that question. I'm not sure it's my job to completely answer the question, but at least offer some considerations to think about. One, rules of engagement. These standards that we've just articulated, whatever they may be, the real standards, real true standards may be, can be helpful in determining the rules of engagement for soldiers. So before soldiers are sent out in the field, they receive briefings and are told how they are allowed to fight, right? So these rules are always resented by soldiers who are subject to them, because any rules that constrain you against your own safety and the safety of your friends will be resented by you, but they constitute a kind of roadmap for keeping everybody's hands clean, so to speak. A kind of roadmap to make it okay to shoot at people, or at least some people. And so as a result, these rules of engagement that can be developed at a time when everybody's head is a little bit cooler and everybody is thinking a little bit more clearly can be helpful for people when they get into the field. Second, professional standards, right? For career officers or military personnel, internalizing a code of conduct inspired by the right rules of just war, whatever they are, can be helpful, both as a psychological bulwark against the horror and guilt that comes with warfare, and they can actually make a difference in the practice of war by socializing participants into rules that keep the quote-unquote game of war, quote-unquote, within bounds, whatever those bounds are. This helps lessen the uncertainty of what's going to happen if I get captured. Am I going to be tortured? Am I going to be fed? Am I going to be shot? Right? So the idea is to lessen those sorts of uncertainties and make it clear what treatment is appropriate. And if each side gives the same concessions to the other side, that kind of reciprocity can be self-sustaining. And all of this helps restrain our natural emotional impulses when we're fighting to see the enemy as evil and as being worthy of any treatment that we could come up with. Now, realists will complain about this, will complain that attempts to civilize warfare are inevitably going to be put those who abide by codes of conduct at a disadvantage compared to those who don't abide by codes of conduct. And so at the end of the day, they're counterproductive to the ultimate goal, which is to win. Pacifists will complain that attempts to civilize warfare will contribute to making the unacceptable seem normal and acceptable. By civilizing warfare, you're making it seem like it's okay to go to war and it's okay to engage in these activities. And pacifists, of course, feel very strongly that it's always not okay. And finally, revisionists will complain that those who write these codes of conduct, will be those who have power. And so the rules we get are never going to be the rules we ought to get. And so the rules of war are never going to, in some sense, be just. There, in principle, exist such rules, but they're never the ones that we're going to get, and never the ones that we're going to be socialized into obeying. Now, I'm not sure it's my job to defend traditionalism or Walzer or any of these views. Really, at the end of the day, you have to make your own mind up on the topic. But against realists, it's worth noting that there are some real gains to be made by civilizing warfare, and not all of the rules always make it hard to win. And Walzer gives us some examples of this. Against the pacifists, it's worth noting that you don't want to make the good the enemy of the perfect. Or, nope, that's the other way around. You don't want to make the perfect the enemy of the good. I need to change that slide, right? By pursuing something perfect, you don't want to avoid things that really do count as improvements, even from the point of view of pacifists. After all, organized warfare is not going anywhere anytime soon, and civilizing it doesn't make it appreciably harder to achieve a world without it. Right? So, given that organized warfare is not going anywhere anytime soon, civilizing it doesn't make the case for pacifism any weaker or any less urgent. And against revisionism, it's worth pointing out that power differentials and nation states aren't going anywhere either. Right? These are the actors that we have to deal with, and these are the situations that we're in. By definition, we're in a non-ideal situation. Being poor or having less power than someone else doesn't automatically make you a saint or immune to moral criticism, right? It's not clear why the standards should apply less, why whatever the standards are, they should apply less to you because you happen to have less power, because you happen to have less money. That being said, I think the case for revisionism is going to either stand or fall depending on whether the revisionist tendency to refuse to distinguish between economic coercion on the one hand and physical coercion on the other can be sustained. Typically, the reason that impoverished or less powerful parties are allowed to use more physical force than those who have power is because they don't see a big distinction between between economic violence, for instance, done to people by keeping them poor and oppressed, and physical violence, which has to do with, of course, exercising actual violence. But of course, they would dispute the idea that physical violence is actual violence, and that keeping people down through economics means is any less physically problematic. In any event, I don't want to get into that debate here, but I just wanted to note that the success or failure of the argument will depend on how you cut up these categories and whether you can make a moral equivalency between, say, putting an embargo on someone and physically harming them. In both cases, the outcome could be similar, but the means will be different. Anyhow, that's what I have for you guys on the law of war.